She thought she was just visiting the ranch. She never went back home. The carpetbag stood by the door near a month. Old brown leather gone soft at the corners, a brass clasp she kept polished even after she stopped meaning to leave. I'd walk past it of a morning to fetch the milk pail, and I'd see it there, packed and ready, and I'd think, well, today's the day she goes. And then it wasn't. And then it wasn't again. I've told this wrong already. Let me back up. I built the place in a valley the maps didn't bother with, up where the grass goes thin and the wind has opinions. Came there alone and stayed alone, and that suited me fine, or I told myself it did, which is near enough the same thing when there's nobody to argue. I'd come a long way to be left be. There was a war behind me that I was on the losing side of, and a piece of country back east I'd called home once, and after the surrender I found I couldn't make my legs carry me back there. Every road that pointed east felt like it was pointing at a grave. So I rode the other way. Kept riding till the land got too high and too hard for most men to want it, and then I stopped, because nobody'd follow me there to take it. That's the kind of man I was, not the kind that fits a town. The town was a day off, a place called Halloran's Crossing, and they'd made up their minds about me long before they had cause to. Calder, that cold devil up the draw. Calder who don't sit in the church, don't drink in the saloon, don't owe and don't lend. They weren't wrong, exactly. I just didn't have the use for them they wanted me to have. A man comes out of a war that took everything he reckoned permanent, the side he believed in, the friends he stood next to, the boy he used to be before he learned what men will do to one another, and he comes out of it with a wariness grown into him deep as marrow. I'd shake your hand and watch your other one. I'd been schooled to. I had one man with me those last years, and that was Reuben Vance. Came to me looking for work the second autumn, a raw-boned kid then, all wrists and Adam's apple, didn't know a cinch from a halter. I near sent him off. We had no use for a green hand and less for the cost of feeding one through a winter. Something stopped me. The way he stood, maybe, like he expected to be turned out and had made up his mind to take it standing. I knew that stance. I'd worn it. So instead of the door, I gave him a fork and pointed at the manure and said, "Let's see, can you finish that before dark?" And he did, and he never once complained of it, and that decided me more than any words could have. So I kept him. 15 years he stayed, and in those 15 years he became the nearest thing to family I let myself have. We didn't talk much. Men who work cattle together don't need to. You learn a man by the way he sets a post, by whether he eases a horse or fights it, by what he does when a calf's coming wrong at 2 in the morning and there's nobody watching to see if he'll quit. Reuben never quit. He learned the whole of the trade off me without my hardly teaching it, just by watching and by caring to get it right. And somewhere in there the watching went both ways, and I got to where I'd rather have his company than my own, which for me was a thing I'd not have believed possible. That's the whole of his eulogy, and it's more than most men earn. He took the chest sickness that last winter. Came on him slow, a cough first that he made light of, then a rattle to it, then the kind of breathing you can hear across a room. I doctored him the only ways I knew. Mustard and goose grease and a kettle steaming day and night till the windows ran and froze and ran again. I rode to the crossing through snow to the horse's chest to fetch what the storekeeper called medicine, which was mostly whiskey and a brown syrup that did nothing I could see but cost a day's travel each way to get. I sat up with him more nights than I slept. Toward the end he couldn't lie flat, so I'd prop him in the chair by the stove, and I'd sit across from him, and we'd watch the fire and not say anything, which was how we'd always done it, only now the not saying had a bottom to it. I'd hear him in the night, the rattle of him, and I'd lie there in my own room knowing the count of it was running down, the way you know a thing you can't bear to know, and I'd get up and go sit with him in the dark so he'd not be in it alone. He'd wake and see me there and not say, "Why are you up?" because he knew why, and I'd not say, "Go back to sleep," because there wasn't much sleep left in him to go back to. We'd just sit. Once, deep in a night, he got to laughing, soft, between the rattles, and I asked him what, and he said, "You remember that mule, the one bit Halloran." And we both got to laughing about a mule had been dead 12 years, 2 grown men in the dark with one of them dying, laughing till the laughing turned to coughing, and I had to thump his back and hold the cup for him. That's the thing nobody tells you about sitting with the dying. There's laughing in it. There's whole nights of small good things, right up against the end. One night near the finish he caught my wrist with that hand gone all bones, and he said, "Calder, I got a sister back in Ohio. Ada, he had to stop and find the air. She don't know I'm out here. We had a falling out long time gone over nothing, the way it's always over nothing." He breathed a while. Words cost him by then, each one paid for. "Tell her," he said, "when it's done, tell her it wasn't her fault, the quiet was mine." I let it go too long, and then I was ashamed of how long, and the shame made it longer. He shut his eyes. Tell her I meant to write. Tell her I had the letter half wrote in my head 10 years and never got it down on paper, and that's the worst thing a man can do to somebody, is mean to and not. I said I would. He died before the thaw, in the gray hour, with the wind walling the cabin in white, and I was holding the cup for him when the rattle just stopped. I sat there a while with the cup in my hand before I understood the quiet for what it was. I couldn't get him to a churchyard nor a churchyard to him, so I wrapped him in his blankets and carried him to the linta where it was cold enough to keep him. And I stood out there in the wind a long time, not wanting to go back into a house that had got so sudden empty. When the ground gave up enough to dig, I dug it, and it didn't give up easy. I was 3 days at it, going down through frost into hardpan, and my hands split, and I kept on, because the one thing I could still do for him was do it right and do it myself and not hand it off to a paid man. I put him on the rise above the spring, where you can see the whole valley and the mountains shoulder up behind. I made a marker out of a wagon board, and I burned his name into it with a hot iron, slow, getting the letters right, doing each one twice so it'd hold against the weather. Reuben Vance. And the years. I stood there a long while after, the way you do, waiting for it to mean something, and it just went on being a board with a name on it and a man under the dirt, the way it does. Then I went inside and I wrote the letter. Took me 3 nights. I'm no hand with a pen. My hands were made for rope and iron, not for the little fiddling work of letters, and I wrote it and burned it and wrote it again, trying to find the words that would carry a thing that size to a stranger 1,000 miles off. I told her what I could, that her brother was a good man, that he didn't suffer at the end any more than a man has to. That there was laughing in it even near the last, which I hoped would comfort her and feared might sound like a lie. That I'd buried him decent on his own ground, for he'd taken up a quarter section that bordered mine, the piece with the spring on it, and proved it up fair and square. I told her he'd spoken of her. I didn't tell her the rest of what he said, the part about the quiet being his, and the shame of it, and the letter he'd meant to write. I figured that was a thing to be said face to face, if it was to be said at all, and I never once expected her face to come within 1,000 miles of mine. I sent it off from the crossing and went back to my work and grieved the way I grieve, which is to say I worked harder and ate less and let my beard go and stopped lighting more than the one lamp, and I figured that was the end of it. A man learns to fold a grief down small and carry it in a pocket. I had a coat by then with a good many pockets. It was near 2 months later. The wagon came up the draw. I was mending the corral, had a rail across my knee and a drawknife working it, the curls of green wood peeling off and the smell of it good in the sun. And I heard them before I saw them, the freighter's team, the dry squeal of an axle that wanted grease. I straightened up and there was Hobbs from the livery on the box, and beside him a woman in gray, sitting straight as a fence picket with her hands folded in her lap and a carpet bag at her feet. I knew her before Hobbs hauled the team down, knew her by the brow. She had Reuben's brow, that high square set to it, and the same way of looking at a thing dead level, like she'd weighed it before you knew she'd seen it. She was maybe 40. Past the first bloom and into the better part, where a face has stopped being pretty and started being itself. Her dress was good and plain and traveled in, dust ground into the hem past beating out. She wore a wedding band, I marked that, and a man's watch on a chain pinned at her breast. A watch too big for a woman that I came to know later had been her husband's. Dead these 4 years of a fever that took half a town and left her with a watch and a roomful of his books and no children to raise nor anybody to need her, which is its own kind of dying, to be left with nobody who needs you. She got down before I could come to help her, which told me something. Stepped off the wheel hub neat as you please and stood in my yard and looked at me, and at the cabin, and at the rise above the spring where the wagon board was, which she couldn't have known but seemed to, and then back at me. "You'll be Mr. Calder," she said. "I'm Ada Sumner, Reuben's sister." I said I knew it. I said I was sorry for her loss, which is a thing you say, and it sat in the air between us being inadequate. She'd come, she said, to see his grave and to settle his affairs and to collect whatever of his there was to collect, and then she'd be out of my way. She said she'd put up at the hotel in the crossing, but Hobbs had told her it was a day's travel each way, and she hadn't the means to do it twice over, so might she trespass on my hospitality the few days it took. She said it like a woman who'd practiced it on the long ride up, who hated to ask, who'd rather have slept in the wagon than be beholden to a stranger. I came to know that about her, That asking cost her dear, that she'd been a long time with nobody to ask, and had got her pride wound up tight around the lack of it, the way I had mine. I told her there was Reuben's room, that it was clean, that she was welcome to it. I told her the stage from the crossing ran of a Wednesday, and the freighter could carry her down to catch it whenever she liked. She thanked me, paid Hobbs, and he turned the team and rattled off down the draw, and then it was just the two of us standing there not knowing what to do with each other, two strangers joined by a dead man, and the wind coming down off the high ground the way it does in the afternoon. I carried her bag in and set it by the door, and that's where it stayed. 3 days, she'd said. The first Wednesday I'd take her down. She was no trouble, I'll say that. Less than no trouble. That first evening I made the supper I always made, which was a thing not fit to set before a person, fried meat and biscuit hard enough to drive nails with. And she ate it without a word of complaint and thanked me for it. And the next morning, without asking and without making a show, she'd found my flour and my soda, and there was bread. Just bread set out on the table, still warm, and a pat of the butter I'd quit bothering to churn since Reuben died, that she'd churned herself out of the cream I'd been letting go to the pigs. I came in off the morning chores, and there it was, and I stood looking at it like it was a thing fallen out of the sky. That was her way. She found the things in my house that wanted doing and started doing them, which was the only way it'd have been tolerable, for if she'd asked leave I'd have told her not to bother and we'd both have been miserable. She just took up the broom, aired the bedding that I'd let go sour, found my socks were more whole than sock and darned them of an evening by the lamp. Found a window with a cracked pane stuffed with rag against the wind and didn't say a word about a man living like that, just packed the rag tighter and tidier so it did the job better. She did it all the way Reuben set a post, like there was a right way, and she meant to do it, and that was the end of the discussion. I want to be careful here, because it'd be easy to make it sound like more than it was those first days. It wasn't anything yet. It was a woman in my house, which was so strange to me that I kept catching the strangeness of it out the corner of my eye, a shawl over the chairback, a smell of soap that wasn't lye soap, hairpins on the windowsill, the particular quiet rustle of a skirt crossing a room I'd heard nothing but my own boots cross for 15 years. I'd lived so long with only my own habits for company that another person's small habits felt loud as gunfire. I didn't dislike it. I didn't trust it either. I'd learned a long time back not to trust a thing that felt good, because the feeling good was generally the bait, and the trap was generally right behind it. I took her up to the grave the second evening. We walked up to the rise and stood at the wagon board, and she read his name and the years, and she didn't cry, not then, just stood with that watch ticking at her breast and her jaw working a little. And after a while she put her bare hand flat on the top of the board, the way you'd lay a hand on a man's shoulder, and she said low, "So I near didn't catch it, you stubborn fool. You couldn't have written one line. All those years, one line." Then she asked me how he'd died, and I told her true, because I judged she was a woman who'd rather have the truth than be spared. I told her about the chest sickness, and the chair by the stove and the kettle, and the riding to the crossing for medicine that did nothing. I told her about the mule and the laughing. She listened to all of it, standing there in the long light with the mountains going blue behind her. When I was done, she said, "Were you with him?" at the end. I said I was holding the cup for him. She nodded, and that was when the tears came, just 2 of them that she didn't bother to wipe. "Thank you," she said, "that he wasn't alone. He was," she stopped, finding it. "He was bad at letting himself be cared for," she said, "even as a boy. He'd take a hurt off and hide it and tell you he was fine while it festered. He'd rather you didn't see he needed anything. I think that's why we fell out in the end. I wanted to mother him, and he wouldn't be mothered, and I took it for him not wanting me, and I went off in a temper, and then the years just closed over it. Like water over a stone. I said runs in the family, maybe, before I could stop myself, and she looked at me sharp, and then something in her face eased, the way river ice eases, with a sound to it almost, a crack and a settling, and she said, "Maybe it does." We walked back down in the dark with the mountains going from blue to black behind us, and the first stars coming out hard and white the way they do at that altitude, and neither of us said anything else, and that was the most I'd talked to a living soul since the snow. I lay awake that night, not troubled exactly, just aware of the house holding another breathing person in it. I'd forgotten the particular weight of that. It's not a thing a man notices he's missing till it's set back down beside him. The first Wednesday came. I had the team hitched at first light to carry her to the stage. She came out with her gray dress brushed and her hat pinned and stood by the wagon, and I went in for her bag, and I picked it up off the floor by the door, and I carried it out. And she looked at it in my hand and looked at the road down the draw, the long, empty pull of it, and she said, "There's still Reuben's things to go through. His tools, his clothes, the papers on the claim. I oughtn't leave it all for you to deal with. It's not right to dump my burden on you and ride off." Which was true, so I set the bag back down inside the door. I want to be honest about this part, because I've turned it over a great many times in the years since, in the dark, when she's sleeping and I'm not. I don't believe she lied. There were Reuben's things to go through, and the papers on the claim were a real tangle that did want sorting. But there's truth a person tells you and there's truth a person tells themselves, and I think that morning she was telling herself one so she didn't have to look square at the other. And I set the bag down quick, before she could think better of it, and I unhitched the team, and I didn't ask myself why I was glad. I'd learned not to ask myself things I didn't want the answers to. A man gets good at that, living alone. It's how the alone gets to be permanent. You stop asking the questions that might pry it open. So she stayed. We went through Reuben's things slow, and it turned out there was more grief in it than work. A man's whole life fits in a smaller space than you'd think. His good shirt he never wore, still folded with the store creases in it. A tin of buttons he'd salvaged off worn-out clothes, a thrifty habit of his I'd teased him over. A folding knife with a deer-foot handle that I knew well, for I'd seen it in his hand 1,000 times, skinning and whittling and cleaning his nails of an evening. And she turned it over and finally pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers on it and said he'd have wanted you to have it. And I didn't argue, though I'd as soon she'd kept it, for it near broke me to feel the shape of it, worn to fit a hand that wasn't there anymore. There was a packet of letters, too, from her. Years of them, tied with a string gone gray, that he'd never answered and never thrown away. She found those at the bottom of his chest and went very still, and took them off to Reuben's room and didn't come out till morning, and I let her be. And in the morning her eyes were swelled but her back was straight, and she made the coffee, and we didn't speak of it. Some grief you carry into a room alone and shut the door on, and the kindest thing another person can do is pretend they didn't hear you in there with it. And the days went on like that, and the carpetbag stayed by the door, and the next Wednesday I didn't even hitch the team, and she didn't mention the stage, and neither did I. Now I have to tell you about the night the heifer calved, because it's where the thing between us turned, though neither of us said so at the time, and maybe didn't know it. It was late spring still, and the weather up there pays no mind to the calendar. A storm came down off the high country in the afternoon, the temperature falling off a cliff, sleet turning to wet snow, the wind throwing it sideways. I had a heifer due, a first-calf heifer, which is the kind most apt to get in trouble, and along about dark she went off by herself the way they do, and I knew by the look of her it was coming and coming wrong. I got her into the shed and got a lantern lit, and I could feel it before I was into the elbow. The calf turned, a leg back, the heifer scared and clamping down and no help to herself at all. It's hard, ugly, bloody work, and there's no dignity in it and no certainty, and a man can do everything right and still bury the both of them by morning. I'd done it alone 100 times. I didn't hear Ada come out through the storm till she was beside me in the lantern light with her sleeves pushed up and her good gray dress already past saving, and she said, "Tell me what to do." I started to tell her to get back in the house out of the weather. She looked at me dead level and said it again, "Tell me what to do," and there wasn't time to argue, so I told her. "Hold the lantern there. Keep it out of the wind. Talk to the heifer low, it gentles them. And when I need both hands free, you'll take the rope." She did all of it. Hours it was. The storm hammered the shed and the lantern guttered, and she shielded it with her own body, and she talked to that frightened animal in a low voice the whole night through, steady, never a tremble in it. And when the moment came that I had the leg worked round and the calf coming and I needed her to haul the rope in time with the heifers straining, she set her heels and hauled like a man, like she'd done it all her life, her jaw set in that square Vance way, and between us we brought it. A bull calf, slick and steaming in the cold, that lay still long enough to stop my heart, and then shook its head and snorted and lived. I cleared its nose, and the heifer turned and began to lick it, and the whole shed filled up with the smell of birth and blood and wet hide. And Ada Sumner sat down right there in the soiled straw in her ruined dress and laughed, breathless, with tears in it, the way you do when a thing you were terrified of turns out all right after all. And she looked up at me, lantern light on her face, blood to her elbows same as mine, and there wasn't a thing soft or fine about either of us in that moment, and she looked at me like she'd never looked at me before. I didn't understand the look then. I understood it later when she told me. She said that was the night she stopped seeing a closed-off, hard old man up a lonely draw and started seeing what I actually was. A man who'd go out into a killing storm at midnight for a dumb beast, because it was his to care for, and caring for what's yours is the whole of a man's worth, near as she could reckon, and that I'd done it not for show, for there was nobody to show, but because it was simply what I was. She'd buried a husband, she said, who was a good enough man in the lamplit hours, but who'd never once, in all their years, shown her what he was when nobody was watching, because she'd never had cause to see him tried. And here in one storming night she'd seen the whole of me tried, and found it sound, and that was a thing, she said, worth more than money and worth more than ease, and most women never get to know it about a man till it's too late to matter. We walked back to the house near dawn, soaked through and stinking and worn to the bone, and she heated water and we cleaned up in turns, and she made coffee, and we sat at the table as the gray came up, not talking, drinking it, and her ruined dress hung steaming by the stove. And it was the most peaceable I'd felt in 15 years, the bone-tired piece of work done right alongside somebody who pulled her share and never flinched. I caught myself thinking I could get used to this, and the thought scared me worse than the storm had, and I shoved it down into one of my pockets and didn't look at it. Now I have to tell you about Teague, because without Teague you won't understand the size of the thing she did. Harmon Teague had the big outfit east of me, down where the grass was good and the water plentiful, everything my country wasn't. He ran 4,000 head and a dozen men and a house with glass in every window, hauled up board by board at a cost that would have bought my whole place twice over. He was a smooth-faced man, younger than me by a decade, with soft hands for a cattleman and a way of talking that made you feel he was doing you a kindness just by aiming words at you. The town loved him. He gave to the church and stood drinks, and his name was painted on the new schoolhouse. He was, by every account that counted to those people, a far better man than me, and maybe by some accounts he was. He'd wanted Reuben's quarter section a long while, not the land Teague had land to burn, the spring. That little quarter held the one reliable head of water in 20 miles, fed off the snow up high so it ran when everything else dried to dust, and in a dry year, which is most years up there, the man who held that spring held the whole valley by the throat. Reuben never would sell it. Teague had come at him with money, and Reuben had named a price 10 times over what it was worth, his way of saying go to hell polite, and Teague had laughed and let it ride, figuring time was on his side. Time generally was for Teague. Then Reuben died, and a sister came out from Ohio who didn't know the country and likely needed the cash, and Teague figured his time had come. He rode up about 3 weeks in, came alone, which was its own kind of message, I don't need men with me to deal with the likes of you. Sat his good-blooded horse in my yard in a coat that cost a year of my labor, and tipped his hat to Ada when she came out and called her Mrs. Sumner, and was, I'll give him this, perfectly courteous. He'd heard of her brother's passing, he said, and was sorry for it. Reuben been a fine hand. He understood she'd be wanting to return to her people, and he'd come to make that easy for her. He named a price for the quarter section. It was a fair price, more than fair. It was more money than Ada Sumner had likely seen at one time in her life, enough to go home in comfort and live easy a good long while. Easy enough she'd not have to ask anybody for anything ever again, which I knew by then was the thing she wanted most in this world. He laid it out reasonable and kind, standing there in my yard with his hat in his hand, and I watched her face while he did it, and I'll tell you my belly went cold because of course she'd take it. Why wouldn't she? A widow with no man and no means, offered a soft landing by a rich one. There wasn't a soul in that country would have blamed her, nor a soul that wouldn't have called her a fool to refuse. And Teague, being no fool himself, didn't stop at the land. He turned that warm voice on her and said the country could be hard on a woman alone, but it needn't be, that a woman of her quality would find herself well thought of, well looked after, that he'd be honored to see she wanted for nothing while she considered her future, and would she perhaps do him the kindness of supper at his house, where there was a roof that didn't leak and a cook who knew her business. He said it all with his hat over his heart, smooth as creek stone, and his eyes flicked once to me and away, taking my measure and finding it small. He was courting her. Right there in my yard, over her brother's grave still settling on the rise, he was making his pitch, and doing it well, offering her everything I couldn't: money, comfort, standing, a young man's strength, a house with glass in the windows, and a cook to lay the table. I stood there in my mended shirt with my dead friend's knife in my pocket, and I had nothing to put against any of it. Not a thing. Ada heard him out. She had a way of hearing a man all the way to the end before she spoke, that I'd come to know she'd let you lay all your cards down, everyone, face up, and only then would she play. When he'd finished, she thanked him for his sympathy and his offer both. She said she'd give the matter the thought it deserved. And she said about supper that it was kind, but that she had obligations here yet, settling her brother's affairs, and Mr. Calder had been generous with his hospitality, and she'd not abuse it by gadding about the country. Teague smiled and said of course, and took his leave, and tipped his hat to me last of all, a little dip of it with the eyes flat, that said plain as words, "You've got nothing she wants, old man, and we both know it." And he rode off easy down the draw, certain the way men like that are always certain that the world would arrange itself the way he'd laid it out, because it generally had. I went back to my fence and told myself it was nothing to me what she did. Told myself hard. It didn't take. That night she was quiet over supper, and I figured she was weighing it, as well she ought, weighing comfort against a hard valley and a closed-off old man, and I tried to make my peace with the picture of the wagon going down the draw for good and the house gone silent again. I'd done silent a long time. I could do it again. I told myself that too, and that didn't take either, because I'd learned by then what the house was like with her in it, and you can't unlearn a thing like that. Once you've heard the bread set warm on the table, you can't go back to not knowing what you were missing. After, she didn't go to her room. She sat at the table with that watch of her husband's in her hand, turning it the way she turned things she was thinking about, and the lamp between us, and finally she said, "You think I should take it?" I said it wasn't my place to say. She said, "I'm asking you to." I sat with that. A man wants in a moment like that to say the thing that'll keep her, and a man who's any kind of man knows he hasn't the right, for I had nothing to offer against Teague's everything, and to argue her out of comfort and into hardship for my own sake would have been the act of a small man. So I said the true thing, which cost me more than digging Reuben's grave had cost me. I said it was a fair price and better than fair, and that Teague was a man of substance who'd keep his word, and that the country was hard and got harder as a body got older, and that she had people back home who'd be glad of her, and that no one would think the worse of her for going. I said she'd be a fool not to, near enough, and I made my voice flat saying it, flat as a frozen pond, so she couldn't hear what it cost. She listened to all of it dead level the way she did, her thumb going round and round the watch. Then she said, "You've told me one thing and left out another." "What's that?" I said. She said, "You've told me what I'd be a fool not to do. You haven't told me what you want." And I found I couldn't. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, big stupid useless hands, scarred and split, and the words wouldn't come up past my throat. 15 years I'd lived not saying things, and a good many years before that I'd spent learning that the things you let yourself want are the things the world takes from you. So the safe play is to want nothing out loud, and I'd gotten so good at it that now, when it mattered more than anything in my whole life had ever mattered, the not saying had grown over the saying like bark grows over a brand, thick and dumb and permanent. I couldn't get to it. I sat there mute as the table. She watched me try and fail. And I'll never forget this. Something gentled in her face, not pity, I'd have hated pity, but a kind of understanding, like she'd seen the shape of the thing I couldn't say and didn't need to hear me say it out loud to know it was there. She reached across that table, and she laid her hand over mine. Just laid it there, warm, with the lamplight on it, her husband's watch set down by the lamp now, ticking, ticking. "You're like him," she said, "like Reuben. You'd cut your own arm off before you'd let a person see you needed anything from them. The two of you." She almost smiled. "I came 2,000 miles," she said, "and found my brother's twin in a man no blood kin to him at all." I didn't pull my hand away. That was all I could manage, but it was something, and she knew it was something, for she'd learned by then to read me, the same as she'd learned to read Reuben too late. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the morning and what she'd do, and I made myself ready for her to go because that's what made sense, that's what a sensible woman did. I built the silence back up around me board by board, the way Teague's house had gone up, getting ready to live in it again. A man can build a thing he hates just by deciding it's coming and bracing for it. Wednesday came, the stage day. I rose before light, and I did what a man does, I hitched the team. Stood out in the cold and got the harness on and told myself I was just being decent, giving her the ride down to her future, not assuming, not asking her to stay where there was nothing for her to stay for but a hard old man in a harder country. The mountains were just coming gray. My breath smoked white. I led the team around to the front, and there she was, standing in the doorway with her hat pinned and her gray dress brushed as clean as it'd ever come again, and the carpet bag in her own 2 hands. She'd carried it out herself. She hadn't waited for me to do it. I felt the bottom go out of me, quiet, the way it does at my age. Not a young man's heartbreak, all noise and fire, but the old kind, that just settles down low in the chest and means to stay. I came and reached for the bag to lift it up to the box. She didn't give it to me. She stood there holding it, looking at me in the gray light, the team blowing steam beside us. And she said, I sat up most of the night with Mr. Teague's offer. I said I figured. She said it's everything sensible. A house that's warm and doesn't leak. A man who'd see I never wanted, never had to ask a soul for anything again as long as I lived. My own people, a day's ride from a doctor, a church pew of a Sunday with folks who'd know my name and nod to me on the street. She said it like she was reading off a list she'd written out careful in the night. Everything a woman in my place is supposed to want. Everything I told myself for 4 years I'd give anything to have again. I said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to it. It was all true, every word, and the truth of it was a stone I had to stand under. And then she set the carpetbag down. In the dirt of the yard, by her feet, the brass clasp catching that first thin light. And she straightened up and looked at me square, dead level, the way her brother used to, the way she'd looked at me the first hour she came down off that wagon. I watched you bury him, she said. I came to find out about it after Hobbs told me, the storekeeper told me. The whole town tells a story on you, Mr. Calder, you'd be surprised. You couldn't get him to a churchyard, so you made the churchyard come to him, up on the prettiest rise in this whole hard country. You were 3 days digging through frost so a paid man wouldn't have to. You burned his name in a board with a hot iron, and you did every letter twice so the weather couldn't take it. You sat up night on night with a dying man and held the cup to his mouth, and you never once let him see it was hard on you, because you knew he'd hate to be a burden. You wrote me a letter that took you 3 nights because you can hardly hold a pen, just to tell a stranger her brother died with somebody beside him. And the night that heifer dropped her calf, you went out into a storm that could have killed you for the sake of one dumb animal. And you'd have done it the same if I'd never come, if there'd been nobody on this earth to know. She drew a breath, and the breath shook, the only part of her that did. Teague's got money, she said. Teague's got a warm house and a young back and the whole town tipping their hats and his name painted on the schoolhouse. And I sat at your table last night and I tried to want it, Will. I tried as hard as I have ever tried at anything, and I could not make it come. It was the first time she'd used my given name. Will. Reuben called me Calder 15 years. The whole town called me Calder, cold devil Calder up the draw. I'd near forgotten I had another name a person might say soft. She said it like it was a thing she'd found and meant to keep. Because I already know what kind of man Teague is, she said. He showed me the whole of him in the way he tipped his hat at you in this yard. And I know what kind of man you are, because you showed me too every single day, only you never once meant to, which is the whole difference, and it is the only difference that has ever mattered to me. She stepped in close, the bag at her feet between us. A woman doesn't get many chances in this life to know a man's true worth before she's tied her years to it. I buried a husband, Will, not knowing the half of what he was, good or ill. I never found out, because nothing ever tried him where I could see. And here I've been handed the rarest thing there is. I've watched you tried a dozen ways for a month, when you didn't know I was watching for anything but the chores. And I'd be the fool, me, the actual fool, to set that down and climb on a stage for a warm house and a soft bed and a man whose insides I've never once seen. Not the other way round, me. And she reached up and she put her hand flat on my chest, over the heart, the way she'd laid it on the wagon board over her brother, and she left it there. And she looked up at me in the cold gray morning with the team steaming and the mountains coming clear and pink behind us, and she said, I'm not going home, Will. I think I'm already there. I'm an old man telling this, and I won't pretend I had words. I didn't. I put my hand over my own heart, my big split useless hand over her smaller one, and I held it there, and that was the whole of what I had to give her, and she took it like it was plenty, like it was everything, like a hard man's hand laid over hers and held was worth more than every word Teague ever oiled out into the air. We stood like that a long while. The sun came up the draw and warmed the yard. Down at the crossing the stage would be loading without her. Somewhere east of us Teague would find out by and by that the spring and the woman both had slipped him, and he'd never once understand how, men like that never do, for the thing that took them off him was a thing he'd never owned and couldn't buy. The carpetbag stayed in the dirt where she'd set it till the sun was full up over the mountains. Then I carried it back inside and set it by the door, and a few days on I carried it up to the loft and emptied it into the chest at the foot of the bed that had been Reuben's and was hers now and then ours, and the bag itself I kept, soft brown leather, the brass clasp she kept polished a whole month meaning to leave. It's up there yet. I take it down and look at it sometimes, the way you do. We were married in the spring by a circuit preacher who came through the crossing, and the town came, the same town that had made up its mind on cold Calder up the draw 20 years before, and they came because she was in it now, and the town took to her the easy way Teague's town had taken to him, only this was real and that had been a thing he bought, and through her they came around to a kind of grudging use for me at last, and I let them for her sake, though I never did sit in the church. She didn't ask me to. She knew which of my closed doors had something behind them worth opening, and which were just walls, and she had the wisdom never to push on a wall. She put glass in the windows herself, 2 panes she ordered up from Denver and set in with her own hands, and a deal of cussing she'd have denied was cussing, smaller than Teague's grand windows and worth 100 of them. And through them you can see the rise above the spring where the wagon board stands, weathered gray now, the name gone faint, that I keep meaning to reburn and never do, because Ada says let it weather, Reuben not want fussing over, and she knew him longer than I did. Before the quiet got into him, and turned him into a man like me. She never went back east, neither of us ever did. 2 people who couldn't go home, me from a war that burned mine down, her from a town a fever emptied out, and between us, out of a hard valley and a good spring and a name burned in a board, we made one. The country stayed hard. It killed stock and split my hands worse and bent us both the way the wind bends the few trees that hold on up there. The years did what years do, took the black out of my beard and the spring out of her step, and gave us, in the trade, a long quiet that I'd not swap for any young man's fire. But of an evening, with the one lamp lit and the wind making its old opinions known against the new glass, she'll come and stand at my shoulder where I sit, and lay her hand flat on me over the heart, the way she did that morning in the cold yard with the stage waiting, and I'll put my old hand over her old hand, and we'll watch the fire and not say anything, which is how the people I've loved have always told me they loved me, and how I've told them back. The bag's still in the loft, soft brown leather, the clasps gone dull as old pewter. I never did polish it again. Never had the need.